Hi everyone, welcome back to this edition of Ruby Talks. Today we're going to be talking all about neurodivergency and I'm really excited to get stuck into this topic. Who better to chat to about this than the wonderful Millie Evans. Millie is an absolute babe. They're a 22-year-old sex educator, TikTok creator, journalist and author of Honest, which is brilliant. And the like little subheading of that is everything they don't tell you about sex, relationships and bodies. They use social media to teach sex ed and engage other young people in loads of different conversations about queerness, neurodivergency, social issues, and also this is very nice timing because they won Young Person of the Year award at the most recent Sexual Health Awards. So yay, congratulations.
Thank you.
If you've not seen my face pop up before, then hi, I'm Ruby Rare. I am also a sex educator. I'm a very proud ambassador for Brook. I worked with them for like 5 years and now do lots of other different sex ed-y stuff in lots of different spaces. And we've got a few questions to ask Millie today. So I'm just really excited to get stuck in with some wonderful conversation. And remember, if you ever need any more information or you've got questions, then Brook has a wonderful website full of loads of like questions and answers, so do head there if you need further information. So let's dive in, Millie. I want to start off I guess this question is just like the origin story. I want to know a bit more about what your sex ed was like growing up and how it's shaped you today, how it's kind of led you to doing the work that you do now, and also a little bit of information about your journey with getting diagnosed as neurodivergent.
Yeah, I mean, I have like the Netflix sex education origin story. Basically, I'm pretty much autist because my parents are in sort of the adult business, and because of that, I had really amazing sex ed at home. Like, curiosity was so encouraged, like questions were answered. At school, like the total opposite, like there was just nothing. And when there were a couple of sessions that we did have, they were just nonsense. They just were so like shame-filled and just unhelpful. So because I had great sex ed at home, nothing at school, and I was seeing the harm that the school sex ed was doing, I was like, this doesn't feel right. I feel like everybody deserves to have what I'm getting at home. So when I was like 13, I started campaigning at school to try and get them to change our sex ed curriculum, going and like
So
talking
cool.
to all of like the senior leadership team to try and get them to change stuff. And I was like, this feels really hard. Why don't we try and change it on like a national level? That seems easier. So like I did join sort of the Family Planning Association's youth council and like joined them and Brook and Terence Higgins Trust in like all their campaign work they were doing back in like 2017 to try and get sex ed to be made compulsory and then to like create a curriculum that would actually work for us. And then like in between various other things, like, you know, trying to finish school and then like starting my first job as a journalist, I just was like never really let go of sex ed. It's worth like noting that sex ed is a special interest for me as an autistic person. So in the same way as when I was younger, I used to be obsessed with Doctor Who and with World War II, now it's sex ed. And I actually brought my folder that I used to bring. Oh, let me find it behind me.
Yes,
I used to bring this folder with me to school every single day, full of like sex ed information that my mum would print off for me.
I know that font so well. I feel like people who've worked in like sexual health or done any other kind of government job, like you know that font so well.
Yeah, like so intimately. Yeah, but like I used to bring this folder with me to school every day from the age of 16 to like in all my like lunch breaks and everything, go and like read through and highlight stuff, and just like I was so obsessed and like I was so passionate about it. And so I don't know how people didn't pick up at that time that I was neurodivergent, but somehow it took until last year. I fortunately have been in therapy for the last few years, and my therapist realized pretty early on that I was autistic and I had ADHD, but it took a bit longer for me to sort of realize that. It's quite a long process of sort of unmasking and figuring it all out. And for a lot of AFAB people and people who are brought up as women and girls, there's a lot of masking and there's a lot of hiding symptoms. And until very recently, pretty much up until the pandemic, loads of sort of professionals weren't recognizing, especially autism in women and girls and in AFAB people. And so up until the pandemic, I also didn't realize because the information just wasn't available to me. And then pretty much TikTok helped me figure this all out because I was seeing like really relatable content. And I was like, you're explaining all the issues I've ever had with friendships and with communication and with time management. I was like, oh, maybe there's something in this.
Sounds a little bit like me.
Yeah, I think so many of us, like, having the space and like alone time during the pandemic really helped people figure out what was going on, and figure out that like the busy world that like was keeping them preoccupied and keeping them away from thinking really deeply about how their brain works, like that had all gone away. And then it was like, oh my gosh, now all these realizations are coming through. So that's how I like realized it, and like it's just been realization after realization since then, pretty much.
Yeah, I feel like it's this that makes it sound like it's a negative thing, but almost I've had experiences of that, of like when you start pulling the thread, you're like, oh, and this as well. Okay, cool. Let's
it's literally everything that like you realize it's all like tied together. Like even issues I've experienced around like sexuality and gender, and not necessarily understanding those or not identifying with sort of heteronormative values and things like that. I'm like, oh, now it makes so much sense, because I don't identify with so many other things as well.
Yeah.
It's just everything sort of comes apart, and then it gets put all back together in a way that's much more comfortable for me, to be honest.
Yeah, and that whole process is a lot of different things, like like coming to terms with, again, that makes it sound negative, like realizing all of this wonderful stuff about yourself is great, but can be quite an overwhelming process.
Yeah.
And I really like thinking about the kind of coming back to when you're starting to put yourself back together again in a slightly different configuration. For anyone who's currently in that bit of going, who am I? What am I doing? It's nice to, as a reminder that it does settle again, and that's a nice thing.
It's kind of like tidying your room. You sort of have to make a mess before you sort of tidy things up.
Yeah.
And like anyone who knows me well can see immediately how much happier I am since just being told you're autistic, you have ADHD, because it's like, oh, everything makes sense now. And it's just like everything was just kind of slotting into place in a way that I had always felt out of place. And now it's like, oh, I get it. And other people get it too. And I can explain it to other people.
Oh, Millie, that's really nice to hear. I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you've got to that place now. Have you done any thinking about like if things would have been different had you been diagnosed earlier?
Yeah, a lot of that, because I mean, especially for parents, I think, and having spoken to my parents about it, they can often carry a lot of guilt for not noticing sooner. But the truth is that like if a professional can't notice sooner, if I myself didn't notice these things sooner, then like how could you? And I personally went to a primary school which had a lot of disabled students and had a lot of students who had really high support needs. And so I was in an environment where they knew about autism and they knew about disability, and they just didn't recognize it. So I've thought about it a lot, but I think that with my personal journey, despite like the stress and the difficulties that I've experienced as a result of not being diagnosed, for me, having realized it at this point has been quite good, because I have all the support systems around me that I otherwise wouldn't have had if I'd realized it younger. And even though getting a diagnosis should enable you to then access support, the truth is it's not always there, it's not always in place. And at my secondary school, I think it would have just meant that I was more ostracized as a disabled person, rather than sort of being able to get the support and being supported to like be a social person. I just think it would have left me even more isolated. So even though I think it probably would have changed things, and it would probably have been better for my physical health, because autism can be quite a physical disability because of the impact of stress on your body, I do think that I'm happy with the realizations I've had. And it's kind of like you sort of grieve what's happened, but now it means I can just kind of move forward with it. So yeah, it's a tricky one to sort of reflect on, because it's like I have no idea what would have been different if things had been earlier.
It's quite nice. I think about it with queerness as well. So earlier this year I got diagnosed with dyslexia, having never had any inkling from myself or from my surroundings, me just thinking that I found things difficult and that was on me. And so similar conversations with my parents, and similar kind of thinking of like, how would university have felt different if I'd known this about myself? And actually that feels similar to queerness, of looking back at moments of my life and reflecting with this information I have about myself now, of going, oh yeah, that was a little baby queer. You didn't know it yet, did you? And hopefully getting to a place where you can, like, there's grief attached to that, but also where you can look at those moments with a lot of kindness and softness, of like, oh, you just didn't know that stuff
and also
yet,
humor. Like so many of the things that I've done in the past are so funny, like looking back on them, like just ways I've got confused about things or confused other people and just like felt like a bit of an alien. It's kind of like, that's quite funny actually, like now that I get it, like then at the time it was a bit confusing and weird, but now it's like, oh, that's so funny and cute and adorable, and like just trying my best growing up.
we're all trying our best.
Absolutely.
And this is a really broad question as well. We're not here to solve all of life's, like tackle all the big conversations here. But in your experience, how does being neurodivergent impact sex and relationships, from the conversations you have with other people, from your personal experiences, if you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one because neurodivergent is a label that covers so many different things. Like it covers things like dyslexia. It also covers autism, ADHD, anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, OCD, like so many different conditions, which are all going to affect you in completely different ways. Like you as a dyslexic are probably going to be affected in different ways to me as an autistic person. So it's kind of hard to say. So I'm going to stick to autism and ADHD because those are things I know really well. But it affects everything pretty much, because with autism specifically, it affects our relationships, it affects communication, it just affects everything. So an example would be that a lot of autistic people can find getting into relationships very overwhelming, because change can be very difficult to process. So bringing a new person into your life, into your routines, having, maybe feeling that you have responsibilities towards them, that change can be really difficult to process and can be quite overwhelming. And you may find that at the beginning of a relationship, you become very focused on it, and it becomes, for some people, it almost becomes a special interest. But then it can become kind of like, feel a little bit claustrophobic, because you're like, oh, everything's changed now, I have to adjust all my routines. And that's something I've heard come up quite a lot. Another thing would be communication. With ADHD, it really affects my memory in often very embarrassing ways. When I've been in relationships, I've really struggled to remember partners' names. And that feels like not only embarrassing, but also hurtful, because it's like, how can you not remember my name? But I just struggle to hold on to names and birthdays and things like that. But also in positive ways, with communication, being autistic means that I'm a pretty honest communicator, and that communication is really, really important to me. That can mean it's quite confusing sometimes, because a lot of dating and sex is in what's unsaid, and a lot of it is in kind of reading between the lines, and that's not always something I can do. Do not attempt to flirt with me, because I will not be able to tell that you're doing it. Just come up to me and say, I like you, and I'll be like, oh, okay. But like, I can be pretty honest. I don't feel that afraid to sort of say how I'm feeling. But then, with feelings, sorry, this is all like leading one into the other, but with feelings, it can be hard to recognize how I'm feeling. I experience alexithymia, which means that it can be hard to read my emotions. I also find it hard to read physical sensations, like being too hot or being hungry or needing to pee. All those things can be really hard to read. And then, like, specifically talking about sex, oh my gosh, there just have been so many things that have come up when I've talked about it online. Like, the second you talk about it online, you give people the opportunity. They're like, oh my gosh, everything. I need to tell you everything. And like, I almost want to write like a whole book about like autistic and ADHD, like sex and relationships. There's so much in there. But the main thing, the main thing that like comes up is just overwhelm. It's things like sensory overload. It's things like distractions. It's things like adjusting to touch, finding things just physically quite overwhelming, not necessarily knowing how to move your body. And like I said earlier, autism and ADHD can be quite physical because of the impacts of stress. And also there are lots of conditions that often come together with those conditions, like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, chronic pain, and those can also affect sex as they are, disabilities. And so like all those things kind of come together and just make it a really complicated experience. And something else that's come up quite a lot is our non-verbal episodes, a bit like episodes of not being able to speak, because even though I can speak to you right now, that's not always the case. When I'm very overwhelmed, the words just won't come out. I can still think them all, but they just do not make the connection to my mouth. And I've experienced that quite often during sex, and lots of people have experienced that during sex. And before I knew I was autistic, I used to describe it as like falling asleep. I felt like I was just like zoning out of my own head, which obviously like raises a lot of concerns about how present you are, about your ability to consent and things like that. I didn't have alternative ways to communicate. So now I kind of understand that going nonverbal isn't always a bad thing, and being overwhelmed during sex isn't always a bad thing either. But it's just something that I have to be really aware of, and I have to have alternative ways of communicating were that to happen. So it's kind of hard to say what's not affected by autism and ADHD, because it is pretty much everything.
Yeah, but all of these are things that we should be talking about all the time. And I think because the messages that we receive about sex from all different angles are very narrow, it's like not opening up the conversation. The fact that when you give people the opportunity to speak about this, it's like the floodgates open and there's all of this stuff. It really shows how important it is that we chat about this.
Yeah, but also while our definitions of sex and relationships and kind of these sort of unspoken rules feel quite prescriptive, it's also not clear enough. There's so much, like I said, it's unsaid, and in sex ed especially, we just expect people to pick up a lot of things. We don't explicitly say them, and that can be really hard as an autistic person, having to read between the lines and having to figure it out, and it's sort of like a bit of a puzzle. It doesn't just come intuitively. It's something I need you to like spell out for me in black and white and like explain to me these sort of rules that are going on. And lots of people online, like, I think that's why a lot of autistic people, before I even knew I was autistic, a lot of them online were sort of finding my social media pages and like really like finding it much more helpful than some other sex ed that they'd found online, because I was accidentally creating this autistic friendly sex ed, but it was just like super like clear and like explicit and like not sort of using any euphemisms or anything they'd have to like read between. It's just like, here's the information as you want to hear it. So yeah,
that's great. I'm curious about, if we're thinking about like sexual health services in all their different forms, what do you think needs to change to make them more accessible for neurodivergent folks? And I guess when I was thinking about this, it was like, are these changes that need to be made on a like person to person basis, or do you think these are changes that could be made to like overhaul services and change them completely? Because I don't know, like so often I think we again typecast like neurodivergency is one thing, which absolutely isn't, but also think of it as a very othered experience, when actually so many people like come up against these things and like really don't find spaces accessible for so many different reasons. So what do you think, if I'm just giving you the reins, if you can like
I think a lot of it is like really simple changes that would help absolutely everybody. I mean, it's clearer communication, it's clearer signposting, it's even in clinic having clearer labels on where you're meant to go places. All those things can just make the experience less stressful. Unfortunately, lots of the changes that happened during the pandemic, with making services available online and making at-home testing more readily available, all those things can be really helpful for an autistic person or for a neurodivergent person, whatever things they find difficult about going into a clinic. But you know, the truth is that like there are different, because there are so many different neurodivergencies, and because even within the same diagnosis like autism, we have got so many different experiences, so many different needs. Basically it's just opening up as many avenues as possible for people to be able to access services, and just really clearly signposting what those are, how to access them, who you'll be speaking to when you're there, giving people advice about how to have that conversation. But like having like exclusively online services would not be helpful to everybody, because some people need to be able to be in person, especially if they're using maybe you know, assisted, they're using sort of devices to communicate. Might be more helpful to do that in person. Other people are going to find that totally anxiety inducing and need to be able to do it online. Like just having all the options available to us is like the best thing possible, and obviously that's going to help the general population as well for so many reasons, whether it's like their working hours or childcare commitments or whatever. Just having all the options available to them is so helpful. And I mean, it'd be helpful if all those services could also be funded, because that would allow clinicians to be able to do their job and to be able to spend proper time with patients, to be able to be really patient with those patients and listen to them and spend time really digging into stuff. But like specifically on neurodivergence, and I think that a lot of clinicians are really sort of crying out for this, just more specific training on neurodivergence and sex and relationships and sexual health, because it does affect your sexual health. And there just isn't enough training. And so many like psychosexual therapists have like sent me messages going like, please explain things to me. And like, there's just nothing out there. And so it's like, yeah, just more training, more research, like just everything could just be really improved, and just so much of it is down to funding and just having the right people in the right places.
Yeah, funding in terms of giving people training adequate time to get used to these things, because I've trained pharmacists before where up until I've started working with them, they've had like an hour of sexual health training in their you know, and then also funding when people are actually using these services to be able to tailor them to what they need. And so often it's not the clinicians, it's like the fault doesn't come on to the clinicians, it's like
absolutely
who are like doing really bloody great jobs. But if we deprioritize these services, then they're going to become even less accessible than they are currently.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's bleak, but it's true.
I mean, also like the thing is that we just don't have enough research into things, and also when it comes to training, you need to let neurodivergent people be involved in doing the training, and neurodivergent people from across different spectrums within their own condition. Like me as an autistic person, like I would happily go and help train people and share like personal experience and things like that, but my experience is not the exclusive autistic ADHD experience. So it's important to have those voices in there. What's really unhelpful, and I actually found this when I was figuring out that I was neurodivergent, is that so much of the clinical advice about disability and about brains comes from people who do not experience those conditions themselves. And so it's kind of like very objective. It's kind of like looking at someone rather than what does it feel like. And so when you're coming in as like, well, this is how I feel, but you're telling me how I look to you, that's like a very big difference. So when you're like training people who are going to be working directly with neurodivergent people, it's really helpful if you can have a neurodivergent person involved in that training as well.
And that feels so obvious, like why would that not be the case? And yet I've been in so many training spaces where that doesn't happen on like loads of different topics. So yeah, I very much agree. I want to chat about TikTok a bit, because every time I see you pop up on there, it makes me smile. You've just got this really wonderful community where you are very up for having these conversations, but as you said, like doing it in a very like explicit but gentle and encouraging way. And it's just been really lovely seeing like how sexual health conversations and sex ed conversations have been able to like thrive on TikTok as a platform. So I want to know what you really like about the platform, but also what needs to improve, and the things like that make, you know, no social media platform is perfect for people chatting about sex. So what you'd like to see improved as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing just because TikTok is kind of like different to most other platforms in that you are sort of reaching people who aren't necessarily seeking out your content. Like obviously the algorithm is very tailored, but you know, there are people who've come across my sex education videos who weren't seeking sex education videos, and now, you know, have been able to educate themselves and be able to scroll through my videos and find something that's relevant to them. And that's really amazing. And you know, it's really amazing to be able to reach people of all ages and all over the world, and that's been really exciting. But like there are huge downsides. I mean, that is a downside in itself. People receiving my sex education where they haven't necessarily asked for it, and I've made mistakes before of like coming in too strong in videos and then making people uncomfortable when they've not wanted to see that on their For You page. And I'm like, okay, totally get that, take on that feedback. But then, you know, at the same time, TikTok is a really difficult platform to put sex ed on. Like I don't know if I necessarily believe in sort of the shadow banning, but there's definitely a lot of issues with posting on there. There's definitely times where I felt like I've really seen the impact of sort of captioning versus not captioning, use like having to censor in captions. Like I remember posting a video about how it's really important that you use the words vulva and vagina, but even within that video, when I captioned it, I had to put V and V because I couldn't put vulva and vagina without the video getting flagged. And that just felt really silly and like embarrassing. So it's like, I'm telling you, you should be using these words, but I can't on this platform.
It's so hard, and you see it all the time. I feel like I'm almost a bit desensitized to it, and then when you just look at it out of context, you go like, oh no, we're all really trying hard, and then when like we literally can't say the words, that like there's just, it does. I don't want to be pessimistic about it, because I think that there is so much opportunity for good, like great stuff on social media, but when you're talking about sex positivity and sex education, it does feel just like wading through mud all the time, when like there's like the interest and in the enthusiasm and people want to learn, but the platforms that like so far are not designed to like for people like us, and that's really hard. And you work around it wonderfully, but it's good to acknowledge that like imagine if you didn't have to worry about that and you could just post the educational information that was important without like all of these little workarounds.
I mean, the one thing I would say, and I think this is maybe a little bit of a secret, but TikTok have done a really good job of connecting directly with creators, and especially in the sex education space and the activism space, they've connected with quite a wide range of creators to be able to ask them questions about what they're doing wrong, what they could do better, and also support us with in terms of like networking events. And, you know, if I were to get a video taken down where I was like, this doesn't make any sense, I would be able to contact someone at TikTok to be able to get that back up, but that's not the case for everybody. What I find the most frustrating about TikTok is that, and it's just the way that algorithms work, but really clickbaity content about sex, content from people who are not in any way qualified to be giving the information that they are giving, those people seem to do really, really well on the platform and don't seem to be penalized for it. Whereas those of us who are trying to give proper sex ed in a way that feels like appropriate and safe for the platform, we tend to get penalized for it more because we're using more honest language. And that can feel really frustrating because it's kind of feels like this weird double standard. And so much of the time that I've spent on TikTok has been counteracting misinformation, especially from brands and from big influencers who just don't really know what they're talking about. And I'm like, oh gosh, but then my video won't get the same reach because it's not as clickbaity, it's not as, you know, gossipy. And that's really tricky. But that's always the case with educational content on social media, to be honest. It's not TikTok specific.
And it's all that I guess that's tricky when it's short form stuff as well, when like there's always more to say, but knowing that the longer you're chatting, the less interested people can be because
absolutely. And like people sort of criticizing you for not including something in a 30-second video, it's just like, oh god, I don't know what else I can do. And like I'm really bad with criticism on social media. I find it really, really difficult. Something I experienced as someone with ADHD is rejection sensitive dysphoria, which means that any kind of rejection or negative feedback hurts really, really badly. So getting that on like en masse on social media has been something I've really had to work hard to cope with. And TikTok, but personally, I find that TikTok is a more positive platform for me than Instagram, because a lot of the people I'm reaching are a bit younger. They're kind of maybe 14, 15 rather than sort of like 17, 18. And that means that I'm having kind of different conversation on there than I am on Instagram. And it's just really interesting reaching all those people and having those conversations and just having really lovely feedback from people that like seeing my video made them go get an STI test, or that they're sort of bringing it up in their school now. And that just is like, that's everything. That's why it's all worth it.
I have a professional wank bank that where like if I get a really nice comment or something, I will screenshot it and put it in
that's lovely.
And then if I'm having a bad day and like I'm just feeling rubbish, or if I like receive some criticism, I can go on there and like look at those things, because it's so easy to take the negative stuff like way harder than the positive. But
absolutely.
I can't remember who, like, I love that phrase. I didn't like, it's not mine originally, but please take it if it's useful for you as well.
I definitely will.
And I also wanted to chat obviously about this wonderful book. It's such a banging cover, by the way.
I know, it's incredible, isn't it?
Well done. It's really like, it's really gorgeous. And I don't know how many people have spotted this. The fact that there's a tiny book on your book is
I know, then on the tiny book there's another tiny book. I love it.
Oh my god, there is. I hadn't noticed that. Wow. Okay, that for that reason alone, people should get this book. I got it a couple of weeks ago and it's just been really wonderful to read through. So congratulations. Writing a book is a feat. Well done.
Thank you.
Looking after yourself throughout the whole process. But I want to know what kind of made you want to write a book, and this book as well. Like, talk us through the process of that, and if there are any bits of it that you're particularly proud of, I'd just love to hear about them.
I mean, I always feel like I'm going to get told off for saying it, but like I didn't actually want to write a book. It didn't cross my mind because I was 19 and I was like, of course I'm not going to write a book. Like I've got to wait 10, 20 years to do that.
Yeah.
And then my literary agent found me on social media and found all my activism and was like, I want to pitch a book that is peer-to-peer, that is by a young person for young people. And I've found you. Would you want to do that? And so then we talked about it a bit more. And I was like, yeah, actually, I think that that I have something to say about this. And I feel like I've got at that point I had like 6 or 7 years of like volunteering in sex education, but I still felt like I wasn't fully qualified. So I was like, let me do a training, let me do some training, let me do some further research and like make sure I feel fully equipped to do this. But I was a journalist already, so like she knew that I could write and I was like, okay, I think I can do this. But I wanted to write it because it just felt really important to have a resource that was by a young person for young people, because there are loads of amazing sex ed books out there. And it's not to say that any of them are getting things wrong, but it is different coming from someone who was a very similar age to you. Given that at the time that I sort of signed the book deal, I was only like a year or so out of school. It's very fresh in my memory what it was like going through that. And yeah, I mean, I found the process itself quite stressful, having like undiagnosed ADHD and like working until like 4 a.m. every single night and then getting up at 8 a.m. for work the next day was quite a lot. I'm not quite sure how I survived that. But I was writing it during the pandemic, which gave me quite a lot of free time to be able to write as well. And at the end of the day, it was just info dumping about my special interests. So it wasn't that hard to get it onto the page. If anything, it was like hard to cut it down. But in terms of like my favorite bits in the book, I really like the introduction and conclusion, because the rest of it's like pretty informational, but the introduction and conclusion are more like where my interests in sex ed lie in terms of activism, campaign work, advocacy, human rights, and talking about sex education as a human rights issue and trying to explain to the reader, this is why you should care about this. It's not just, oh, I feel like I should know about my body, or I feel like I should know about consent. I'm like, you should know about this because you deserve to know about it. It's a human rights issue, and you should want to, not only give yourself the knowledge, but you should want to pass it on, and you should, maybe you want to contribute to campaigns and help to protect sex ed. And that was just kind of like my call to action that felt really important to include. So I really enjoyed writing the introduction and the conclusion, because it's like that to me is like what separates it from some other sex ed books that are written for young people, because some of them can be very much like, here's the information, in and out, whereas I'm like, no, like take this learning and let's see where else it can go. And I have had young people who've read it who have messaged me and said that they've started campaigning, or that they've brought it up with their council or with their school, and that like those like little small seeds of change sort of came from the introduction and conclusion. So that's why they feel so special.
Oh my God, that's really amazing. Like, it's sort of warming people up, because getting that kind of just straight talking, this is the information that you need to know, can be really overwhelming. And also it can be like, again, we talk about it's easy, whatever your age, but particularly when you're no longer a young person, to talk about young people as this like one size fits all category. Actually, everyone is approaching this content and information from a really unique angle. But to have something that contextualizes why this is so important in all of our lives is just wonderful. So I'm glad I think it's like quite an instinctive thing. It's just I'm always asking why, and like I think it's important to tell people why they should care about the thing you're trying to teach them about. And like talking about, I mean, there are so many reasons why you should care about sex ed, obviously, but talking about it from a human rights angle, I've always found has been the thing that's made people listen. When I've been doing campaign work or talking to MPs or whatever, that's the point where I'm like, you're actually neglecting your responsibility to look after young people and to educate them and provide them with resources to access their human rights. And they're like, oh, it's not just about STIs and public health, which to me is equally important. So I don't know why they don't care about that. But it's when you kind of remind people this is actually quite serious and it's about violence, it's about protecting people. That's kind of what made them sort of sit up and listen. So I thought, let's include it. It feels important. Oh, wow. Well, I, as no longer a young person anymore, sadly, I mean, also like, I'm happy where I'm at, don't worry. And that's interesting as well. I really love learning from peers, but also learning from people older and younger than me.
Absolutely.
Like all of that too. But so whatever your age, honestly, Millie's book is amazing. And if you're a young person, then like brilliant, this is designed for you. But I think especially for people who are interested in this subject who are a bit older, it's really good to hear it coming from your voice. So thank you so much. You've put something wonderful out into the world.
Thank you. It's so kind of you.
To end, I've got a little quick fire round. So we've just got like 3 super speedy questions for you. First of all, advice for fellow neurodivergent young people.
Take some time to think about how you feel and about your boundaries and about what you want and don't want before you get into situations where you're going to have to make those decisions in like a really speedy way. Just take the time ahead of time to think about what you want and need. It's way easier than trying to figure out in the moment. And also just communicate. Once you figure those things out, tell other people.
Nice. I like them. If you could change one thing about the school relationship and sex ed curriculum, what would it be?
Oh God. I want to see more education about disability, because so many of us are disabled in so many different ways, and there are so many things that we can do to navigate sex and relationships in different ways with our disabilities. Just want to see more information about that because it affects so many of us.
Yeah. Okay, leave it with me. I'll sort it out. And finally, advice for feeling more confident talking about sex.
Remember that it's meant to be fun. It's not meant to be absolutely terrifying and scary. And if it does feel terrifying and scary, just sit with that and ask yourself why it feels that way and how you can inject a bit more fun and interest and curiosity into that.
Yay. Oh, what lovely answers. Yes,
thank you.
Absolutely. It's been such a joy chatting with you. It's always nice. I mean, it is funny, the like sex ed, queer, I guess like a bit neurospicy thing of just like, we all must have colourful hair. But it's really nice chatting to another like fellow pink-haired person. But thank you. You put such wonderful stuff out into the world, and it's just been really nice chatting and learning from you. And I look forward to doing that more and more. Could you let people know, if they haven't seen your face online before, where they can find you?
Yeah, across every social media platform, my handle is @itsmillyevans.
Cool. Yay. And this is a wonderful book. Go buy it, please. And be sure to follow Brook_sex positive if you don't already, for really wonderful sexual health content. I will be back chatting to another wonderful person soon. But for now, thank you so much, Millie. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye.